We're proud to welcome you to the Exceptional Advisor podcast series brought to you by the Investments and Wealth Institute. This series aims to help you to better serve your clients, differentiate yourself from the competition, and enhance your ability to communicate those differences. Hi, I'm your host, Bob Powell.
My guest today is Steve Horan. He's a senior strategic advisor with the Investments and Wealth Institute. He's also the executive editor of Financial Planning Review, and most recently, he was named the director of the Master of Science in Finance and Investment Management at the University of North Carolina, Wilmington. So welcome to the podcast, Steve.
Well, and thanks so much, Bob. Great to be here.
Pleasure. So before we get going, for the benefit of our listeners who may not be familiar with you and your resume, do you mind giving us a brief overview?
Yeah, absolutely. So I started off on the buy side in the industry 30 years ago, and eventually went into a PhD program and became a professor. And then spent 15 years after that at CFA Institute, ran the CFA program for most of that time. And now I'm back in the academy and doing research around sustainable investing, leveraged ETFs, and historically still doing things based on wealth management.
Right. So I think it's important to note that you're doing some work for the Investments and Wealth Institute a little bit there.
Absolutely. So really happy to be working with IWI as a senior advisor. And one of the things that gives me joy about that, in addition to working with you, Bob, is their position in the industry of putting client first and having that first and foremost in terms of education, training, ethics, and the like. And if we keep our eye on that ball, I think we'll end up making the world a better place.
Yeah, and the other thing we should note too is that you most recently were named the editor of a very prestigious journal as well.
Yeah, that's right. So just joined as executive editor for the Financial Planning Review. So a relatively new journal established in 2018 and really doing great work trying to push the boundaries of financial planning and having us think more expansively about what that means. So I'm very excited to help push that ball forward too.
Yeah, it's really exciting to think that we move from what some have described as junk science to real science as you think about the art and science of financial planning.
No, I think that's right. And to a large extent, I think we've hidden behind the notion of financial planning being more of an art than a science. But I think what we thought was art, there's actually science there, and we just didn't fully understand it. And we still don't, but slowly it gets revealed.
That's great. Anything that can bridge the world of academia to the practical world is, I think, a step in the right direction. So our topic today is the future of wealth management, but we need to start by defining what the heck wealth management is.
Yeah, well, good luck with that, because it's, you ask economists, if the market's going to go up or down, you get 10 different people you ask the question to, you get 12 different answers. Wealth management's the same way, but, certainly common themes cut across. And, everyone will tell you that it's a holistic, client-driven process. But, then the question becomes, well, what does that mean? And the way I tend to think about it is that, financial planners will often want to say wealth management is financial planning, and investment managers will want to say it's investment management. And it actually transcends all of those. It's really kind of the knitting, the glue that holds that all together. And going one step beneath the investments in terms of, what's the ultimate purpose? How is this actually going to improve a client's outcome? What is the spending on, and, where's the money coming from, and things like that. So wealth management is, everyone will agree, multidimensional. The disagreement is what are those dimensions? And increasingly, it's becoming broader and not narrower. And I think that has real implications for those that are not just entering the field, but those that are in the field.
Yeah. I mean, when I think about certainly financial planning, I think about the 5 or 6 basic elements being insurance, taxes, investments, retirement planning, and estate planning. And wealth management includes all of those things and then some. Is that fair to say?
It does. Yeah. So I'm glad you sort of anchored us on those traditional core areas. And I absolutely would agree with that. And, increasingly the, CFP board, for example, has formally introduced psychology as a topic area in their body of knowledge. Now, to a large extent, that's a manifestation of what's been with us for decades under the title of behavioral finance. But it's elevating it, at least in some fashion, to its own domain. And I think that's significant. And I think it's true because, some people now are using the term, well, are you a financial advisor or are you a financial counselor? How much of our work with clients really revolves around what we call behavioral influences, how we frame a choice, and nudges that we might give a client to help them improve their financial outcomes. I last year was working as a chief strategy officer for a startup company developing a financial planning app that revolves around habit formation. And it was, yes, trying to promote financial literacy. Yes, there was an educational element. Yes, there was a technological element to deal with data, collecting it, reporting it. But the real value proposition was leveraging psychology to help users with healthy habit formation. And, to one degree or another, all wealth managers have to deal with those kind of issues, whether it's family dynamics for the ultra high net worth and dealing with not just group dynamics, but family dynamics, succession planning with a business, or succession planning for a patriarch within a family dynamic, and issues that color decisions around estate planning. Huge, right? Psychological and behavioral overlays on all of these. So we become more effective when we recognize those.
I know we're going to talk about certifications later, but thankfully the IWI has a certification, CPWA, that addresses some of these domains that you've.
That's exactly right. And what's really wonderful about that program is it's grounded in investment management, but it goes beyond investment management. And focuses to a large extent how those serving high net worth and ultra high net worth clients can make the most out of capital formation in ways that augment the investment management strategy. I like to tell folks, I'm an investment manager, and that's what I was trained in. My PhD is in finance, and I've taught investment management for a good part of my career. When push comes to shove, though, trying to create predictable value through investment management is a tough business. We all know how difficult alpha is to come by and how difficult it is to predict it. But there's a lot of other ways we can create different kinds of alpha that are larger and more predictable around tax management, cost control, even spending management if we have to, optimizing things like Social Security for the mass affluent. Yeah. There are very sensible decisions one can make. And what's, I think, what I hope for one day is that these sources of value that wealth managers create for their clients are one day incorporated into our business models. Because right now our business models are tied to investment management. That's why we all call ourselves investment managers, and that's why we're all seeking alpha and, natural incentives. But when we're able to build a model around these other sources of value creation, which, by the way, can be as simple as you've articulated what it is you want to accomplish with your capital over a long period of time. Have I helped you achieve that goal? If we can find a way to monetize the success of that, we will have a richer business model that I think more accurately reflects the value we can bring.
Yeah. So I know we're going to talk more about business models in a little bit. You have would it be best to describe it as a contrary point of view on whether wealth management is a profession or not?
I think it might be contrary, but it might not be for some, so I think professions have certain elements. And so you can just go down and ask, does wealth management have these elements? And so social scientists have, looked at this for decades. And first and foremost, a profession places the interest of its clients and the interests of society at large ahead of its own. Right. So it necessarily places itself in a subservient fashion. So, we can have a long discussion about what that means. Yeah. Okay. Is it fee structure or whatever? Yeah. But, that's a fundamental element. A profession would also have a specialized body of knowledge. And in addition to which I think we have to a large extent, although it's a little amorphous around the edges. It also has a specialized code of conduct. And what's important is that those two things work together, because what they do is if one masters the body of knowledge and at least masters intellectually the code of conduct, they can be used to render judgments with integrity, even in an environment of uncertainty, because we all come across situations that don't have clear answers. Integrity is, are we, using that judgment in the client's interest as opposed to ours? And reasonable people can always come to different conclusions. Yeah. A profession interest, and we see this in medicine all the time, yeah, has a systematic approach to learning from experience, both collectively and individually. So that's what residency is all about in medicine. And I'm not sure we have that same analog in wealth management. I think you see examples of apprenticeships, but they're maybe more the exception than the rule. And a profession will monitor the behavior of its members, and they'll also monitor the competencies and the continued competencies of their members. So I think as we go down a list like that, we have some, yeah, and of those elements, but maybe not all. And then you can also say, well, and then who's in charge of them, right? Because the investments in wealth body of knowledge is going to differ from the CFP board body of knowledge and the CFA Institute body of knowledge. So, there's not a single source of truth to right, even that.
Yeah. So what are your prospects for, we seems to meet some of the criteria, but maybe not all of it, or we meet some of it, but only to maybe not to the nth degree.
will he ever become a profession?
I do. I absolutely believe that. What I know from observing other professions and how they've developed, medicine, accounting, and law, it's a long, long cycle. It wasn't, in the early 1600s in England, medical practice was divided into three buckets. You had university trained physicians who were the elite. You had surgeons who were almost like mechanics.
Yeah.
And that included barbers. And, they were the ones that were trained in hospitals through apprenticeships.
Right. So
you had apothecary.
Haircut or appendix.
Right. Exactly. Haircut or appendix. And then you had your apothecaries, and, like so much of what, this country has today, that was ported over. And in colonial times, it just didn't work really well in this sort of, less established environment. And professional societies around medicine started to develop around the mid 1700s. But, it took 40 or 50 years for them to actually 40 or 50 years beyond that to actually evolve to the point where they were establishing regulations and standards of practice and were being put in charge of the certification of doctors. So, and then roll the clock forward just from, I would maybe even say, a scientific perspective. It wasn't until the 1950s that medicine had a systematic way to evaluate whether or not the decisions they made actually came to some positive effect, right? And there was no double-blind control studies in the 1940s. It wasn't until a Scottish doctor by the name of Archie Cochrane that developed double-blind control studies and what we think of today as clinical epidemiology. So, that's the relatively recent innovation. So if we put ourselves on that same arc, I'd say we're kind of, beginning to middle of that arc more than the end. But that is ultimately where it goes.
Yeah. So it's interesting. Do you see if you think about that arc, that we end up having advisors who go to universities, who then go to a teaching hospital, who then go to a setting in which they practice wealth management, and there's a professional society that regulates them, either much like the CPAs having local state chapters, or in the case of medicine, medical boards, et cetera. Is that the path that you see or predict?
I think a version of that, right? And I think I say a version of it because I think the possibilities today now are very different, right? I think, the elements that path brought to the table remain important, but now there's different paths to God, if you will. Technology enables a whole different way of learning. I'm in higher education and I'm a fan of higher education. But I also think that there's alternatives to higher education that might play a role in kind of that more traditional path. So, and that's one of the reasons I'm a fan of certification. Mm-hmm. And so excited to be working with Investments in Wealth Institute, because I think that certification is going to be playing an outsized role in the professionalization of wealth management.
Yeah, expand on that. Talk more about the use and value of certifications.
Well, so, certifications have two primary sources of value. So the first understandably, is that they develop skills. Somebody both knows more than they did before and is able to do something that they couldn't do before. And that's valuable. But that has actually more to do with the learning than the actual certification at the end of the learning, which relates to the second point. And that's certification sends a signal that somebody has mastered a certain competency.
Yeah.
And that's particularly valuable for young people and industry entrants that don't have a lot of other ways to send a signal and might otherwise, you might otherwise think wouldn't have it. But those are two separable things. I can learn without certification, but I can't certify without learning.
Yeah.
And so I think that's really important to understand that distinction, because sometimes we conflate the two, and sometimes we conflate certification with higher education. Yeah. And both are learning paths, but they're fundamentally different, because certification is much more focused on specific job tasks. It's much more standardized and more temporal. It has typically a professional standards component. My higher education degree says nothing about the integrity with which I do my work. And nor am I required to continually learn once I've earned my degree. So, there are absolute differences between the two, but both are being influenced by fundamental and secular trends in how people are learning. We've got a shift towards a gig economy where people are very granular in the skills that they're bringing to the market, and they're bringing that skill to multiple clients. And so that creates a demand for programs that are now increasingly specialized, because people graduate from college and say, boy, I learned a lot, but I'm not using a lot.
Yeah.
And so that seems to be something of an inefficient way to develop that skill. And I think that's why you see MBA program enrollments going down even, quite dramatically, but Masters of Science in Finance and other specialized programs are going up. The CFA is struggling. It's an investment management generalist degree, but other specialized designations are doing quite well. In fact, we've seen more designations created in the investment management industry in the last 5 years than we have in the last 35 years.
Yeah.
And why is that? And when we look at what those new designations are, they are specialized. They're around alternatives or data analysis, or, the market technicians, or retirement, right? As some of my dear friends know, right, Bob?
Yep.
So let me toss that question back at you. So retirement's a more specialized designation. What makes the case for something more specialized like that?
Well, the topics that you need to know in retirement are far different than the topics you need to know when you're planning for retirement. So in retirement, you need to know about Social Security claiming strategies, or Medicare components, or RMDs, or beneficiary designations. And the list goes on and on and on. There's a more specialized knowledge around planning for retirement income than planning to accumulate a nest egg.
Yep. And as you say that, it strikes me that one dimension of that specialization is localization, right? That curriculum does not play outside these borders, because everything you just described
is US centric. Yep.
Is US centric. So, so I think that's, this shift towards specialization, I think, is really, really important. And that's driving learning. So, and, I think what you're seeing too is that increasingly credentialing bodies are becoming professional development partners with employers and with universities. So you try to think of this triumvirate, universities creating product for employers to buy and certification bodies creating product for employers to buy. And they're kind of banding together, employers like UBS and BlackRock and Dimensional Fund have all created internal universities to educate either their own staff and or even their clients, or in the case of DFA, advisors that would be carrying their product to the clients. And these are very purpose-driven universities, and increasingly partnering with certification bodies and partnering with other universities to develop and deliver their curriculum. I'd say too, the learning experience is fundamentally different. It's really kind of funny because I was a university professor for 10 years. I was, pretty good at my gig. I left for 15, and the world I went back to didn't look a whole lot like the world I left.
Right.
And the learning experience is fundamentally different.
Yeah.
Especially in the United States. So it clearly, one, is more digital. And, my first semester back, I signed a textbook and just naively thought students would buy the textbook, and they don't, right? They read it online. It's I think I had one student that bought a physical textbook. Everything else was read online. And learning is very much a service-oriented business. And it needs to be designed for very short attention spans. And I don't say this in any kind of bemoaning way. I think all of this is a gravitation towards who we are as human beings, not what we have become as human beings, right? And so, and certification is needing to deliver their products, if you will, in very much that same environment, digital first, nicely packaged and nicely delivered.
And it's interesting, my experience in that world has been, at least in the world of professional education and credentialing, is one, to accommodate the different kinds of learning styles that you may encounter. And secondly, the work environment that your student is in. I found, for instance, that most of my students would do their work on weekends after work and cram in all that they had to do on Saturday and Sunday before the next week began for the next assignment, whatever it might be. And as much as we try to encourage people to start on Monday, invariably work got in the way of their studies.
We are all procrastinators. And but the digital world is here to stay, and again, that's where technology comes into play. So I'm a director of a fully online Master's of Science of Finance program at the University of North Carolina at Wilmington, and it's designed for exactly the student you've just described. And you can design the experience to provide nudges, to provide natural resting points in the longer progression of the program, and keep people engaged. And those are very effective. And just kind of, closing the circle a little bit, are all based on behavioral psychology.
Someday, not today, but we'll have a longer discussion about habit formation. It's a favorite topic of mine, and I've written extensively about it. And I have an anecdote to share about a woman who formerly worked at Procter & Gamble and was credited with changing behavior around Febreze. There was a time at which Procter & Gamble was going to shelve it, right, Febreze, but she was able to figure out how to cue the behavior to get people to spray Febreze. It's an interesting story, but we'll save that for another time. I'm curious now that we've talked about the use and value of certifications. We've talked a little bit about wealth management, where it is, whether it's a profession. Where is it going, and how is it changing? What do you see there?
So, yeah, I think, it's going wherever it's going there kind of quickly, right? So, so first of all, there continues to be this secular shift from institutional money management to private wealth management, nothing stopping that train, and it will continue apace. And that's net good, right, for wealth management. There is also a continued trend for private markets, in particular, alternative assets generally. But, in last year, there were over 6,200 private equity deals worth over $1 trillion brought to the market. I mean, that's a banner year, great asset price, tailwind to that, but really just phenomenal. But that's not just a manifestation of a single year, right? That's a multi-year trend. And what that means for advisors is developing new skills. And that gives advisors an opportunity to differentiate themselves as well. And that's not to suggest that an alternative investment should be in every investor's portfolio, but it should be part of most advisors' vernacular and in toolkit. So the other thing that I think really pitches to the strong side for wealth management is that, the old world was all around security selection, right? And what kind of cash do they have on the balance sheet? What are the margins and what are they going to do? Yep. What kind of sales growth are we going to get? And, that world still exists, but for increasingly what's happening is the unit of analysis is shifting from the security to the product, where the product is some collection of securities. And it may not be as simple as a mutual fund. It could be an ETF, could be a leveraged ETF or a structured product, which gets very complicated very quickly. And there's all sorts of layers of what that product looks like, legal layers with the wrappers, or it can just be fundamentally different, like cryptocurrencies. Is it a currency? And whether you're pro or con, any of those products, you need to understand them enough to know with your pro or con. And so I think that's really important for the advisor, because they need, again, to understand them well enough to have at least a conversation with a client around them.
I just wrote about defined outcome or buffered ETFs, which were described as structured products for the masses. And it's an interesting product, right? Fairly new in the marketplace, but it's yet one more thing an advisor has to learn about as they think about their quiver and all the arrows that need to be in it.
Absolutely. And, the challenge for a lot of us is that, Bob, I'm going to put us in this bucket, but a lot of we advisors are male, pale, and stale. So 70% of us are male, 77% of us are white, and at best we're in our mid 40s.
Yeah.
So those aren't our prime learning years. So there's going to be turnover in the advisor pool just as much as there's going to be turnover in the client pool. And, that whole transfer of wealth, there's going to be a transfer of books of business as well. And therein lies the opportunity for diversity. And, Obviously lots of efforts behind that. Investments and Wealth Institute pitching in with their center and offering scholarships into the SEMA program for those from diverse backgrounds. And those are all really necessary elements where I think we need to spend a bit more time and attention is thinking about the front of the pipeline and getting more diverse talent interested in either investment management or wealth management at a much younger age. And people argue about what that right point is, whether it's high school, college, or whatever. And I think one of the reasons we haven't done that is because that's a really long burn. Everyone's looking for quick wins on this one because it really needs to be addressed sooner rather than later. But I think we need to address the long burn channel as well, because it's very difficult to get somebody off of another career path once they've gone down it. And getting them early is easier than getting them from another career path. So, but the turnover we have with advisors will be, an opportunity to accomplish that.
Yeah. Let's. We're going to make two parts out of our podcast, and I think we could end with client demographics, perhaps, and where that's going, and then we'll leave the cliffhangers of technology and topics like the business model that we want to get to, and ESG is a favorite topic, as well as the regulatory world. We'll cover those in part 2. But why don't we, if you don't mind, we can end with what you see going on in the world of client demographics.
Yeah. So there is really interesting because there we're seeing more diversity, if you will. So the baby boomer wealth transfer is in flight. Okay, that is taking place, and that's making our clientele younger. Not as much as they're older, they're becoming younger as well, and so they're also clearly more technologically savvy, and we'll get more into the technology in part 2, but what that does mean is not that robo-advisors are going to replace the wealth manager, or wealth managers need to become robo-advisors, but they need to meet their clients where they are and figure out what that means in a digital sense. So, and as a result of that, because clients can do more on their own, they're more confident and they're more demanding. And so, the question of, well, what am I paying you for if I can do this is a common one. And, we need to have answers for that. And I think there are answers to that, by the way. I think there's a lot of them, but that's going to go back to skill development.
Right.
And, so that's part of this evolution, is we need to develop new ways of doing business that then require some new skills. And yes, some of that's going to be around technology. Some of that's going to be around ESG, which we'll talk about in part 2 as well. Some of it's going to be around private markets and non-fungible tokens and the like. So, and that's what makes this field so god awfully interesting, is that there's constantly something new to learn. And, the world ends up becoming our classroom. I taught economics this past semester. There could not have been a better time to teach economics than this past spring. And where every day you opened up the newspaper was another lesson. So, that makes it exciting for those that, want to continue that learning process.
All right. Well, I want to encourage our listeners to tune into part 2, because I'm especially eager to talk about NFTs and what Bill Gates has had to say about NFTs. And I'm especially interested to talk about the business models. We've seen so many experts talk about the AUM model being a dinosaur, being replaced by retainers and other methods of paying for advice and wealth management. But it's a moving target at the moment. So I can't wait to learn your opinions, and I hope our viewers, listeners, can't wait to hear them as well. So stay tuned. Thank you, Steve.
Thanks, Bob. It's been a lot of fun.
Thank you for listening to the Exceptional Advisor podcast, brought to you by the Investments and Wealth Institute. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe through iTunes, Spotify, or our website at www.investmentsandwealth.org/podcast to get the latest episodes of our Exceptional Advisor podcast series. For additional resources, updates on events, and exclusive membership deals, visit www.investmentsandwealth.org.